The Federal Writers Project, America's Hidden Supernatural Archive 230, formerly enslaved people testified to the supernatural forces that sustained them through slavery's darkest hours. Between 1936 and 1938, in the waning years of the Great Depression, unemployed writers fanned out across the American South, carrying notebooks, pencils, and a mission from the federal government. They were agents of the Federal Writers Project, a New Deal work relief program administered by the Works Progress Administration, and their assignment was straightforward. Find the last living generation of people who had been born into slavery and record their stories before those voices were lost forever. The result was the Slave Narrative Collection, now preserved in the Library of Congress. Over 230 interviews, the most extensive primary source documentation of enslaved African American life in existence, collected from the people who had lived it. Men and women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, speaking across the decades about childhoods spent in bondage, about families separated by sale, about the day freedom came and the hard years that followed. But woven throughout these testimonies, documented with the same careful attention as accounts of cotton picking and auction blocks and midnight flights to freedom, is another record entirely. A record of conjure doctors and root workers, of gree-gree bags and haints, of spiritual forces invoked for protection and for harm, of a supernatural tradition practiced by people who had almost nothing else, maintained under conditions of absolute coercion and preserved in their own words. The interviewers were not paranormal researchers. They were writers and journalists and academics employed by a government program to collect social history. They arrived at the homes of elderly black Southerners with no training in folklore documentation and no particular interest in the supernatural. Their job was to record life history, and if their informants spoke of conjure and root work and encounters with the dead, the interviewers wrote it down. Some did so respectfully, treating the supernatural content as central to their subjects' accounts. Others were condescending, reducing spiritual testimony to curiosity or embellishment. The quality of the supernatural documentation varies accordingly, but across 230 interviews conducted independently across the former slaveholding states, the volume of supernatural testimony is enormous, and its consistency is striking. The narratives document the full range of the African American spiritual tradition as it was practiced in the 19th century South. Conjure doctors appear again and again, consulted for healing, for protection, for revenge. Root workers who could place a crossing on an enemy or remove one placed by someone else. Men and women who made gree-gree bags, small bundles of roots and herbs and personal items, charged with specific intent and carried on the body or hidden in the home. The narratives describe what these practitioners did, how they were paid, what they promised, and what happened when their workings succeeded or failed. The dead appear frequently, haints, the tradition called them. Spirits of the recently departed who lingered near the places they had known in life. The narratives document encounters with these presences in specific locations, certain roads, certain cabins, certain trees. Informants describe seeing figures that should not have been there, hearing voices, feeling watched. They describe the methods used to protect against haints, the prayers and practices that kept the dead at a safe distance. And they describe what happened when those protections failed. The narratives also document something more difficult to categorize, accounts of supernatural intervention in the events of enslaved life. A woman who prayed for deliverance and whose enslaver perished days later. A man who carried a conjure root given to him by another enslaved person who believed it protected him from violence and who survived when others around him did not. These are not stories told at second hand. They are first-person testimonies preserved in the words of people describing what they believed had happened to them. And the narratives document the role of spiritual practice in resistance. The charms carried by people who ran north. The prayers understood as protective during the most dangerous acts of self-assertion. The root work directed against enslavers, against overseers, against anyone who held power over the enslaved. The tradition gave its practitioners tools, and they used those tools in circumstances the tradition had not been designed for but proved capable of serving. What makes the supernatural content of the slave narratives significant is not any single account. Individual stories of Conjure and Haints exist in abundance throughout African American folklore. What makes these narratives different is the scale and consistency of the documentation. Over 23 people interviewed independently across multiple states, describing a spiritual tradition in terms that align with remarkable precision. The same terminology, the same practices, the same understanding of how spiritual forces operate and how human beings interact with them. This is not folklore collected by scholars seeking supernatural content. This is social history collected by government employees seeking economic and biographical information, who happen to be interviewing people for whom spiritual practice was so central to daily life that they could not give an accurate account of that life without describing it. The Federal Writers' Project ended in 1939. The interviews were filed, catalogued, and largely forgotten by the general public for decades. Scholars used them, historians cited them, but the collection remained obscure, accessible only to researchers willing to travel to archives or work through microfilm. Then, the Library of Congress digitized the collection, made it freely available online, and the slave narratives became, for the first time, widely accessible to anyone seeking to understand what the African American spiritual tradition looked like in its most active period. Researchers returned to the collection with new questions. What had been read as biographical testimony was reread as documentation of a living tradition. The supernatural content, previously treated as incidental or colorful detail, was recognized as the most complete picture available of Hoodoo and Conjure as they were actually practiced by the people who maintained them. The narratives reveal a tradition under extreme pressure. Enslaved people lived under total coercion. They could be sold, separated from family, subjected to violence with no legal recourse. In that context, spiritual practice was one of the few forms of agency available. A conjure doctor could not prevent a sale. A gree-gree bag could not change the law. But they gave people something to do, some way to assert intention and will in circumstances designed to strip both away. And the tradition served. The narratives document that service. They document people who believed their prayers were answered, who believed their charms worked, who believed they had survived because of what they carried or what they knew. Whether those beliefs reflected objective supernatural reality or the psychological necessity of maintaining agency under impossible conditions is a question the narratives do not answer. What they document is what people did and what they believed about what they did. The danger in the slave narrative archive is not supernatural. There are no cursed objects, no malevolent entities waiting to reach through the page. What is dangerous, in the sense of being deeply uncomfortable and morally demanding, is what the narratives reveal about the conditions under which this tradition was maintained. The violence is everywhere in these accounts. So is the nullity, the legal non-existence of the enslaved as human beings with rights. And so is the fact that spiritual practice flourished under those conditions, not despite them, but because of them, because the tradition gave people something the law could not take away. The Hoodoo practitioner placing a crossing on an enslaver, the woman praying for protection before running north, the man carrying a conjure root because someone told him it would keep him safe. They are all in the narratives, speaking in their own words, describing what they did and why they did it, and what they believed about the forces they were working with. The Federal Writers' Project slave narratives stand as the most important single archive in the documentation of the African American supernatural tradition. Not because they were created for that purpose, not because the interviewers understood what they were collecting, but because they captured, in the testimony of 23 people who had lived through slavery, the reality of a spiritual practice that was central to survival and resistance under the worst conditions of American history. The collection is freely available now, digitized, searchable, waiting for anyone who wants to understand what a tradition does when everything else has been taken from the people who carry it. It endures. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.